Okay, so let's talk about, remember at the bottom of that appendix 1 is sort of addressing the issue of tolerances and crop destruct. So let's talk about tolerance. What on earth do I mean by tolerances? So we have a poll for you.
Okay, so this poll is asking, a tolerance is the maximum amount of pesticide residue that can be on a commodity at the time of the last application, when it leaves the country, or at harvest. So what is a tolerance? All right, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. All right.
Okay. Thank you. So 89% of you said that a tolerance is the maximum amount of pesticide residue that can be on a commodity at harvest. And that's absolutely correct. So here we go. It's the maximum pesticide residue level. And it has to be measured in a laboratory setting. So you can't just go out there like with a microscope and be like, oh, I'm at 5 parts per billion. I'm cool. Like, you don't know. It has to be sent out for, like lab analysis. But let's talk about this. So tolerances are established at the federal level. They're in the California, the code of the 40 CFR Code of Federal Regulations. They're in part 180. I think I might be able to have the link for you. And perhaps the last page of the handouts is a list of all the links. I believe I included that. I'm sorry, March is like by far the busiest month of my whole life, and March is not over yet. You just don't even know. So I can't remember every single thing that I've done this month. I just cannot possibly do it. So, so here we go. So what do I want to say about a tolerance? So tell me, most people, I believe, on this call have not had to look up a tolerance. So tell me, and that's totally cool. That's what I would expect. Why on earth would anybody ever look up a tolerance? Tell me why. Like when, in what situation would you find yourself needing to look up a tolerance in connection with one of your experimental pesticide trials? So you can tell me in the chat. Okay. So I see some responses that say, if you've sprayed at a higher rate, you don't know if you've exceeded the tolerance. So the tolerances that are here in the 40 CFR are based on what the EPA registered label tells you. Essentially, if you're following EPA label instructions, EPA registered label instructions, you are not going to exceed the tolerance. But if you're spraying at a higher rate, that's use in conflict, and you might exceed the tolerance. Okay, you don't know. If you are making more frequent applications, that's use in conflict, and it might result in too high of residues, of tolerance, exceeding the tolerance. And so if you want to do all these things, you can, but if that commodity, I'm talking commodities that are going to be eaten by humans or animals or consumed, because we drink things too. So if this commodity is ever going to be consumed by humans or animals, then the pesticides at harvest cannot exceed the tolerance. So you may have to do crop destruct if you exceed the tolerance, or if you have no idea if you've exceeded it. So if you're following label instructions, you're not exceeding the tolerance. Totally not. Tolerances are established federally. not at the state. So if you've got an EPA registered label, you are not exceeding the tolerance as long as you're following the instructions. So sometimes researchers are doing research with very high value crops, and the cooperator is not interested in doing crop destruct. Okay, so at that point, you need to figure out what the tolerance is for your pesticide, and then you need to do a residue analysis at the time of harvest. So meaning, I mean, I can go into more detail about this. I don't want to belabor all of the steps because it doesn't apply to everybody. But if you're in that situation, then let's chat later. But basically, you need to take a representative sample of what will be harvested and send it out to a lab for residue analysis. And if you've exceeded the tolerance, you have to do crop destruct, or you got to wait to harvest. Okay, but if you haven't exceeded the tolerance, even if you used the pesticide in conflict with the label, then it's fine, but you have to have proof that you didn't exceed the tolerance. Okay, so you could potentially exceed a tolerance if you are using a pesticide not in accordance with the label. So is there a question, Katrina?
Yeah, there is a question. It kind of goes back to the previous slide, though. It's about whether a cooperator needs to report the use for research authorization and experimental trial if they're the one purchasing the pesticide. If they have to report the pesticide use, I guess.
Well, all experimental research trials, all pesticide applications to production ag or research or production of an ag commodity have to be reported. So it doesn't matter if it's experimental or not, you are supposed to report. So the cooperator can report, or you can report on behalf of the cooperator. It's probably easier for the cooperator to report along with their other, pesticides that they've used that month.
Right, and there wouldn't be any violation, right? Because the research use authorization has gone through the ag commissioners. They would be aware that the cooperator is using.
So you have to.
So
this is sort of jumping ahead to a future section, but basically, you would want to report to experimental commodity. So whatever the code is for experimental commodity, that's how you report. So don't report peaches if you are applying to peaches, but you're way exceeding the rate. Don't do that because that raises red flags. It would be reporting to experimental commodity, and then you report what pesticide you used and at what rate.
Okay, and then there's one more question, but I think you're about to get to it. If there's no tolerance, then it is a crop destruct, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you have exceeded the tolerance, you think you've exceeded the tolerance, or there is no tolerance, you have to crop destruct. That whatever cannot enter the channels of trade. You cannot feed it to a pig. You cannot feed it to a cow. You cannot give it away. It cannot be consumed. It has to be destroyed. So one thing I did want to say about tolerances is that they're established by active ingredient. You're not going to look up a registration number here or a product name. It's by active ingredient. So I have here, I know that you can't see it well, but this is the tolerances for azoxystrobin, and then it's by tolerance, it's by active ingredient, and then it's each commodity. But I just want to point out something that so the different end uses of the commodity could have a different tolerance for the same active ingredient. So here it's corn field forage has 12 parts per million. Okay, that's the tolerance. You don't need to remember that. Just for a second, remember it. But corn, field, and grain has a 0.05 part per million tolerance. Okay, so the end use of that commodity determines the tolerance. It's not all citrus. It's if you're selling the fresh citrus or you are juicing the citrus, that's a different tolerance. So you need to make sure that the specific end use of your commodity is on the tolerance list. And there are some pesticides that have an exemption from tolerance. They're mostly things like those things that are listed as they're lower toxicity products. They're like clove oil and things like that. Okay. So commodities treated with any experimental pesticide for which there's no residue tolerance and there's no exemption from a tolerance, they cannot enter the channels of trade or in any way be made for use as a human or animal food or feed or drink. Okay. And you as a research supervisor has primary responsibility to ensure that the treated commodity is posted as experimental and also destroyed. So I want to address a comment that Luis made. So no, I think I already addressed it. So if you're not really sure if you've exceeded the tolerance because you're going against some label statements and it's a high value crop, you can send it out for residue analysis. And then, you know, as long you got to keep the proof that you have not exceeded the tolerance, and then it can enter the channels of trade, even though you've used that pesticide in conflict with the label. Now, like your cooperator couldn't do this unless you were involved in the research trial. They can't just do this for their commercial, the commercial side of their operation. This is specifically because it's related to a research project. So destroyed means rendered unfit for utilization as human or animal feed. So one example is, you know, burning the hay. But some people till it under or disc it under, or you just smash it, and like the IR4 program has their own special procedure. So it can't be used as animal feed just because you can't sell it or something like that. So when you have if you have a plot, my assumption is that, you know, like you've got like 12 plots in your trial, and maybe, you know, 5 of them have an experimental pesticide because you're doing all different types of pesticide applications, right? So it's just, you know, those plots technically that have to be destroyed. Like it's the ones that you don't have a tolerance for. But so the remaining plant parts, so like if you've got a tree or something that just like is never going to go away, like it's a perennial, right? Then there is this crop destruct tape. So, and then you can put that just on the trees where you're doing an experimental pesticide application. But you could also do it like, you know, put orange fencing and a sign around, you know, that area of the research plot that where you're doing these experimental applications that will be destroyed. So it's just, you have to be very clear, because whether we're working with cooperators or we're working on UC property, you have to make it very clear which plots have to be destroyed, because you don't want anybody coming out and like, oh, that strawberry looks good, I'm going to take it. No, they shouldn't be doing that anyways. But that's especially egregious if you're in an experimental situation where you don't have a tolerance for that, because you have no idea what the health implications are of that. Did you have a question?
Yeah, Luis had a follow-up question on that note. He's asking, do only federally registered products have a tolerance?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So tolerances are established at the federal level. So they're not established. DPR does not have the authority to establish a tolerance. And that's why it's really hard to know what pesticides can be used, for example, on cannabis or on hemp. So cannabis is federally illegal. I don't know why I'm mentioning cannabis is going to open a can of worms, but no tolerances are going to be established on cannabis federally for a while. So that's why it's hard to use pesticides on cannabis. And then hemp, hopefully the FDA has some determinations to make, because EPA and FDA work together on these tolerances. Anyway, so with hemp, it's actually, you know, it's not an illegal commodity anymore. And so presumably tolerances will be established so that, you know, more pesticides can be used on hemp. But yes, that's the reason why hemp and cannabis are so complicated, because DPR doesn't have the authority to establish a tolerance, and they would never register something that's not already registered by EPA. They just simply don't have the authority to do that, except for something like an adjuvant, which is not required to be registered by EPA. So where was I going with that? What was the question? Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Did I address the question? I already forgot.
I think you did. I mean, there's also, I think there's also the point that all pesticides need to be federally registered, right, Lisa? There are no pesticides that are only California registered, correct?
Yeah, except for the ones that aren't required to be registered by EPA. Yeah.
Like adjuvants.
Mhm.
Okay.
Exactly. So it's important to post these. So there is this field posting sign that's really specific to this. Okay, you don't have to use the sign, but these are the words that have to be on the sign. You can make your own sign, but it has to be, you know, like legible, readable from like 25 feet. Readable by whose eyes, I don't know. Like the regulation doesn't actually specify that, but somebody with like normal or corrected vision should be able to read this sign from 25 feet away. And it has to be in a second language if that's applicable to the employees that could be potentially entering that area. So commodity treated with experimental pesticide, do not harvest. Okay. So again, so the crop destruct intention is written into that Appendix 1 document. So you have to say, I'm going to crop destruct, or I don't need to crop destruct, or I have a non-bearing or non-edible commodity and no crop destruct. Like if you're doing applications on ornamentals and no animals or humans are intended to eat the what comes off of those plants, you absolutely do not have to destroy that crop or that commodity. So some CAC county ag commissioners would like, 24-hour notice of crop destruct. Remember on that Appendix 1, there is like a place where you can indicate when you think that you will be doing crop destruct. But, none of us can actually predict the future. I try all the time and I'm terrible at it. So I think the same is true for everybody else in this virtual room. We can't really predict the future. So sometimes that changes. So if it changes significantly, then please communicate with your county ag commissioner. Sometimes they like to be there, or they like to do compliance assistance, or they just want to know what's going on. Because they're sort of responsible if something goes wrong as well. So, they just need to know. And so just check with them when you're submitting your, Appendix 1, like, do you want to be there? What do you want me to do? Like, what do you want me to do beside tell you when I think I'm going to destroy this crop? So I often get calls either from researchers or from a county ag commissioner staff. Sometimes there's turnover in the staff. So you might be working with a new person, or you might be new to this type of research and they're like, what the heck is going on? You can't do this research. You don't have an RA, research authorization, or you can't do this because it's against the label. This is an enforcement letter. It's a link to, a copy of the enforcement letter. Enforcement letter is a letter written by DPR headquarters to communicate some issue to the counties, to the county ag commissioners. And this very specifically communicates UC has a pesticide research policy. They are allowed to do experimental applications if they result in an exceedance of a tolerance that's permitted by law. Then they can do crop destruct, and that's what they'll do. So it is a communication tool. So sometimes you have to provide that to your ag commissioner staff if they're just unfamiliar with this particular process. They have big jobs. They have to, know a lot of things. So sometimes this is a thing that they may not know. So what happens if you are making experimental applications with a cooperator and you go out there and everything that you were supposed to crop destruct has been harvested? It's gone. Like, that's a problem, right? Okay, we can just recognize that that's a problem. So you need to don't just like run away and like go off the grid. You need to get on the phone and start notifying people immediately. The most important thing here is that they be able to trace where that harvested commodity went and remove it from the channels of trade, because it is not safe. It is not necessarily safe for human consumption. We simply don't know because the studies haven't been done, and that's why there's no tolerance established. Or we do know, and nobody would ever establish a tolerance because the human health effects are bad. So notify the CAC, notify your cooperator, notify somebody at DPR, I would assume, enforcement people, but also I think the ag commissioner would elevate it to their DPR enforcement person. UC A&R, that's not me. I would say that that's probably Brian Oatman. He might tell you it's me, but I'm going to tell you it's Brian Oatman because I really have no authority to do anything. I just tell you guys what to do, but I can't make you do it. So maybe Brian can, I'm not sure. And then if you're on a campus, then notify your department chair. And if you're in a county, then notify your county director. So, I mean, you can keep me in the loop, but I don't know, like what's most important is that we remove that harvested commodity from the channels of trade and that it gets destroyed. So I haven't been here for 17 years, but I've been doing this job for probably this part of my job for like 8 or 9 years. And this list precedes me. So for the last 17 years, no known violations. I mean, I don't want to hear about it if it's in the past and I can't do anything about it. So I don't want to know. But let's just keep it at this. I would love nothing more than to next year change this number from 17 to 18. So food or feed treated with pesticides that are registered for application on the test site and applied at or below the registered label rates can be harvested and allowed to enter the channels of trade, as long as you've followed all label and state regulatory conditions. Okay. So basically, if you've got a registered pesticide and you're following the label instructions, you're fine. You're not going to exceed the tolerance. I do have one poll for you. I forgot to say, we're going to take a break in just a few minutes. I want to get through this section and then we're going to take a 5-minute break. So we're going to launch this poll.
Okay, so this question is asking, you are using a pesticide that is registered by the US EPA, but is not registered in California. You're following all label instructions. Do you need to be concerned about exceeding the tolerance? Yes or no? And I couldn't remember who in the chat, or there's a lot of Johns in the poll or on the webinar today. So the John who was asking about site ID numbers, I responded to your question in the Q&A, but I don't know if it notified you. So just thought I'd put that little plug in right here.
What is the answer, Sarah?
Well, I asked for a little more clarification because I wasn't totally sure, but basically if you're doing non-production ag pest control, a site ID number is not required. It's only for production ag. But even though a site ID number is not required, you do need, like the business or the individual applying that pesticide needs an operator ID number, which is the number you put on your pesticide use report. And that's probably the number you would be putting on any other paperwork or authorizations that are connected to you and your research or your pesticide use.
So I'm wondering if I could update that Appendix 1 form, not just to say cooperator instead of grower, but instead of site ID, I can add some information like operator ID if it's not production ag or something, just give better instructions on that. So, okay.
Yeah, it was a good question because it is kind of confusing. So,
yep.
All right, I'm going to let you answer this question, Lisa.
Thank you. And also, just as a note, I mean, honestly, this policy and the Appendix 1 was written with ag in mind. And so when I went through and I updated the policy, I really tried to make it broad because I know we have a lot more pesticide researchers outside of and not involved in production ag. So anywhere where you feel like it's not clear for ag versus non-ag, I really would like for you to tell me, even if it's just in an email, you don't have to say it on the webinar, because I would like to make it more clear for people. So thank you. I really appreciate that question. Okay, so if you're using a pesticide that is registered by US EPA and it's not registered in California, we're following all label instructions. So that's an experimental application. In California, it's experimental. In Nevada, not experimental. In California, it is. Okay. But do you have to worry about exceeding the tolerance if you're following all the label instructions? We are just split right down the middle. But the no's inched out ahead of the yeses, which means that the no's have it. So it's correct. So basically, because tolerances are federally established, if it's not registered in California, it's just the EPA label that you need to follow in order to avoid exceeding a tolerance. So if something is registered by EPA, but not in California, it's experimental, right? But you can still harvest it and it can enter the channels of trade. You're not going to exceed a federal tolerance if you're following the federal label instructions. So any questions on that? Sometimes that throws people for a loop. Okay. Basically, if you're following the federal label, you're cool. Or if you're following the label, you're cool. Okay. So pesticides that are applied above label rates, that, wait, what am I saying? Experimental applications may include those that are above the label rate. And so if you're doing that, or if you're shortening the PHI, or if you are shortening the retreatment interval from what the label says, then you have to worry about tolerance. So if you are using this in conflict with any label registered by EPA and or California, then you do need to worry about the tolerance. And then you could either crop destruct or do a lab analysis to ensure that you haven't exceeded the tolerance. Or you can search in the tolerance exemptions. You might be exempt from a tolerance. Not likely if it's a conventional pesticide, just going to say it. So when you file the pesticide use report, when either you or your cooperator file the pesticide use report, you report it to research commodity. You don't report it to tomatoes or walnuts if you've exceeded a label rate, because that raises red flags in pesticide use reporting system. So this is easy. It's just a better way to do it. What the reason behind the pesticide use reporting requirements is really to see how much pesticide we're putting out in the state of California. Okay. It's not tied to it's just, they just want to know what pesticides are being applied. Okay. That's what they want to know. So you research commodity instead of what you actually applied it to. So I hear often enough that people say that they are reporting their pesticide use, but the ag commissioner is like, no, I don't want your pesticide use report. Please do not report that you applied 0.005 ounces of this pesticide to a research commodity in my county. I don't want to know that. Like, they don't want you to add it to their pesticide use report. And that's fine. I mean, I would communicate with your ag commissioner, but the thing is, the policy and the state rules do say that you're supposed to report pesticide use. Your cooperator is supposed to report pesticide use. I'm not going to sit here and say, don't report pesticide use. But I'm going to tell you to communicate with your ag commissioner and to maintain a very good relationship with them, because you have to work with them. So whatever, I would just, you need to talk to them and communicate with them about, your whole research trial, but really in particular, the pesticide use report and sort of what their preference is. But maybe explain to them that I'm going to report to research commodity. Is that okay? And so obviously it's much more important if you're doing large scale research trials or a lot with the same pesticide.